Honestly, I get my knockouts alone are worth 50K US alone. That's the knockouts.
This is business, cutthroat as Vegas, and Israel Adesanya was absolutely not joking when he uttered those words. Just moments ago, he dropped a bombshell announcement. He's officially leaving the UFC, and get this. His decision has absolutely nothing to do with injuries or any kind of decline in his fighting ability. He's simply walking away because Dana White, the man in charge, actually lowered his pay. What's even crazier, what makes this a truly surprising twist, is that Israel isn't the only fighter making this kind of bold move right now. This shockwave announcement has sent tremors through every single corner of the fight game. Adesanya didn't just reveal he's leaving the UFC. The reason he gave was as brutal and direct as any knockout he's ever landed inside the Octagon. Dana White cut his pay. This wasn't some quiet rumor, no backroom leak, no sources say speculation. This came straight from Adesanya himself, and his first words were so scorching, so undeniable, they instantly rewrote the entire MMA landscape. He didn't whisper it. He didn't try to sugarcoat it. He said it with the exact same icy composure he used when he famously walked down Robert Whittaker in Melbourne. And here's the line that is, without a doubt, going to haunt the UFC for years to come. If they think they can slash my pay and I'll just bow, they've forgotten who I am. That was the precise moment everything changed. That was the moment fans knew this wasn't some strategic negotiation tactic. This wasn't a cheap publicity stunt. This wasn't just another fighter asking for more money. This was a true superstar, a global name who rose to prominence through sheer self-belief, through a consistent refusal to be undervalued, through building his own powerful brand without the UFC ever truly creating him, finally hitting his absolute breaking point. If you've followed Adesanya even casually, you already know his obsession with fair compensation isn't anything new. He's always talked openly about how fighters are systematically underpaid. You've seen him lay it all out in countless interviews, leaving no room for doubt.
Look, I do well for myself. I'm more worried about the guys coming up because I'm such a big fan of the UFC, regardless of what people might think or have their opinions about the company. This is business, and it's cutthroat. It's Vegas.
Honestly, he wasn't exaggerating even a little bit. And he certainly wasn't just complaining. He was stating pure, undeniable economic facts. He put it so plainly, the UFC is now a massive $21.4 billion company, and yet, fighter bonuses haven't changed in years. He spoke passionately about how many fighters are forced to live like part-time workers, barely scraping by. He even highlighted how some of his own teammates had to take on personal training gigs on the side just to survive, and he absolutely hated that reality. He argued vehemently that fighters should be drafted into the UFC the same way athletes are drafted into the NFL, emphasizing that the UFC should represent a prestigious career path, not merely a side hustle for its athletes. All of this has been meticulously documented, it's all been public knowledge, and his stance has been consistently unwavering. And yet, here's the craziest part, the absolute absurdity of it all. The UFC, the very company he headlined for, the company he made millions for, the company that actively marketed him as a global superstar, actually believed they could get away with lowering his pay. This isn't some far-fetched notion if you just look at the documented receipts. Fighters across the board have been complaining about persistent pay issues for years now. Adesanya himself, with his characteristic bluntness, once famously described the UFC as the devil's asshole, when he was talking about just how cutthroat and ruthless the business truly is. He wasn't lying, he wasn't being dramatic, he was simply being brutally honest. And before all the UFC apologists come charging in, spewing the tired old line, well, fighters don't make the company makes the fighters, let's just take a moment and remind everyone of the actual, undeniable history here. Adesanya absolutely did not come into the UFC like some unknown rookie, making a measly $10,000 to show and another $10,000 to win. No, he arrived as a fully fledged superstar, walking in with immense leverage, proven numbers, and an already formidable reputation. You can see the record in black and white. His debut was anything but a standard rookie deal. In his own words, I did about $50,000 in my first fight. Then I got a $50,000 bonus. Altogether, I made over 6 figures in my first UFC fight. Another interview from a different angle confirms that exact same number. I didn't make the 10 and 10 like everyone else. I made six figures and then a $50,000 bonus on top of that. Meaning from day one, the UFC paid him significantly above the standard rookie rate because he brought undeniable value. He knew it, they knew it, and the fans certainly knew it. So just imagine this scenario. A fighter who has never once taken a lowball offer, a fighter who has always negotiated from a position of strength, a fighter who has openly stated across multiple interviews that he was committed to growing the sport, but refused to fight for pennies. Now picture someone like that walking into a meeting, sitting down with the most powerful man in MMA, Dana White, only to hear the words, "Your next deal isn't going to be what it used to be." And that, my friends, brings us to the real, agonizing heart of this entire story. Because Adesanya has never been shy about calling out hypocrisy. He's never been afraid to speak his mind. You can look back at his UFC 2034 press conference and see how consistently he addressed money directly. He wasn't being greedy, he wasn't being dramatic. He was asking a perfectly fair question about compensation directly tied to his performance and his undeniable draw power. This was years ago, and what did he get in return? At UFC 2048, the public purse said $500,000, but everyone in the know understood that wasn't even close to the whole story. According to public records and every reputable MMA outlet, the real money came from back-end deals and massive pay-per-view point. He absolutely deserved it. He earned every cent, he was the headliner, he was the draw, he was the primary reason millions tuned in, and when he spectacularly regained the belt at UFC 2087, he didn't just get paid, he got paid like the bona fide superstar he was. Adesanya earned a staggering total of $3.118 million, with nearly $2 million of that coming directly from PPV points. That number right there, the $3.118 million figure, is the smoking gun in this whole saga. Because once you've paid a fighter that much, once you've officially acknowledged their colossal drawing power, once you've witnessed them sell out arenas from Miami to Melbourne, headlining some of your most successful events in history, how on earth do you justify turning around and lowering their pay? This is the part the UFC will never publicly address, precisely because it makes them look absolutely terrible. And Adesanya wasn't even subtle about how things were really going behind the scenes. He talked openly about the UFC's cutthroat environment, he talked openly about business being business, he talked openly about fighters being consistently undervalued, but even he didn't expect the UFC to try this. Because after UFC 305, a fight where he still made over $2.43 million despite losing, he walked into renegotiations genuinely believing he had already proved his worth beyond any question. What he didn't know, what he truly couldn't have predicted, was that Dana White was preparing to drop one of the most stunning, disrespectful, and downright insulting financial decisions ever made against a fighter of Adesanya's magnitude. And this, my friends, is where everything truly spiraled. This is where the story becomes almost unbelievable. This is where the real betrayal begins. Because the very moment Adesanya heard the new offer, a number so ridiculously low it made him initially think someone was joking, he said the room went completely quiet. He said he stared at Dana in sheer disbelief, and he said something profound inside him changed forever. He said it felt like an irreparable line had been crossed. And what happened next will absolutely blow this entire story wide open. So there he was, Israel Adesanya, one of the most recognizable, electrifying, and marketable athletes the UFC has ever had the privilege of signing, staring across the table at the man who had built a billion-dollar empire squarely on the backs of fighters just like him. And all Adesanya could think was, after everything I've done for this company, this is what they think I'm worth. Because the number Dana slid across that table wasn't just a lowball, it wasn't just a tough negotiation, it wasn't just business as usual. It was an outright insult, a blatant slap in the face, a stark reminder that in the cold, unforgiving UFC machine, absolutely nobody, not even Israel Adesanya, is immune from being squeezed, undercut, or devalued. But here's the crucial part. This wasn't the first time a champion had been treated like a replaceable cog. The UFC has done this before, again and again, to its biggest stars, to its legends, to fighters who literally built entire weight class. Anyone who's paid even the slightest attention has seen this pattern. Adesanya himself has commented on it. Fighters like Francis Ngannou famously walked away after years of bitter pay disputes the UFC vehemently denied, even while Ngannou himself revealed, I asked for health insurance, and they said absolutely not. This is not an isolated situation. This is not an accident. This is a clear, undeniable pattern. Adesanya knew that. He's talked about the broken fighter pay structure for years, whether he was asking why bonuses haven't increased since forever, or negotiating aggressively behind the scenes, because he refused to be just another statistic. In multiple interviews he stated outright that many fighters are undervalued, underpaid, and trapped in contracts that would make other major sports leagues crumble under scrutiny. And when you step back and look at the bigger picture, the betrayal gets even worse. Adesanya wasn't entering that negotiation as a struggling contender or an unproven challenger. He was entering as a fighter who had single-handedly carried entire pay-per-view events on his back. He was entering as a former champion whose fight week highlights alone draw millions of views. He was entering as a global celebrity who boasts lucrative endorsement deals with major brands, who headlines sold-out stadiums, who literally built the middleweight division into a mainstream spectacle. And yet, the UFC offered him less. Not slightly less, not a small adjustment. They outright attempted to cut the pay of one of the most bankable stars in the organization's entire history. But the public announcement was only the spark. The real explosion came when people began to dig into why Adesanya walked away. It all comes down to the power shift behind his exit. To truly understand just how outrageous Dana White's move was, you need to grasp the full context of Adesanya's immense earning power. The man wasn't just cashing checks. He was printing revenue for the company, and when you pay a fighter numbers like Adesanya's, you're admitting something profound. They are a superstar. They are a certified needle mover. They are absolutely not replaceable, no matter what the circumstances were, no matter the outcome, no matter the opponent. Adesanya consistently remained one of the highest paid fighters on the entire roster. So when Dana White sat there and had the sheer audacity to propose a contract that drastically undercut those established numbers, that wasn't business, that wasn't tough negotiation, that was a deliberate message, and Adesanya heard it loud and clear. Because this wasn't just a low number, this was, according to those extremely close to him, a crater compared to what he'd earned previously. Think about that for a moment. Think about a company making billions, telling its top performer, we're going to need you to accept less. It wouldn't happen in the NFL. It wouldn't happen in the NBA. It wouldn't happen in boxing. But in a company where fighters have no union, no collective bargaining, no guaranteed minimum earnings, zero transparency, no pension, and bonuses that haven't changed in over a decade, it happens regularly. And here's where things get even more shocking. Adesanya didn't just reject the offer. He didn't just push the number back across the table. He didn't just say, I'm worth more. He stood up calmly and stated, I'm not fighting for you anymore. Those words, that single sentence, that precise moment, the moment the UFC's middleweight king walked away from the negotiating table and walked away from the company entirely. The people in the room genuinely thought he was bluffing. They thought he'd storm out, cool off, talk to his coaches, talk to his management, sleep on it. They thought he'd be back tomorrow, ready to compromise. They didn't understand him at all. Which is precisely what makes this next part even more unbelievable. Because the moment he stood up, said he was done, and began walking out of that room, Dana couldn't even stop him. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. Because for the first time in a very long time, he realized he had profoundly miscalculated. You simply can't intimidate a man who built his own brand. You can't threaten a man who has options. You can't squeeze a man who doesn't need your money. And right then at that exact moment, the balance of power completely flipped. But what truly lit a fire under Adesanya, what really pushed him over the edge, what truly made him say, I'm out, was the second offer the UFC put in front of him. Because yes, they tried again. And this second offer wasn't just worse. It was downright insulting. A number so absurdly low, it felt like a joke. A number so outrageous that people who heard it said they thought it was a typo. To fully grasp how disrespectful it was, think of everything Adesanya has ever said about fighter pay, about transparency, about bonuses, about PPV revenue, about fairness. Think of how consistently he has fought for fighters to be treated as legitimate professionals. Then imagine the UFC putting an offer on the table that contradicted absolutely everything he had ever stood for. He couldn't accept it. He wouldn't accept it. And that is the exact moment he decided to walk away from the UFC for good. Now here's where everything becomes even more sinister, because the UFC did try to keep him, but not through money, not through respect, not through better terms. No, they tried to keep him the one way the UFC always tries to control fighters: leverage, pressure, and manipulating the public narrative. But Adesanya wasn't having any of it. And the conversation that happened next, the one Adesanya said he will never forget, is the moment this entire story goes nuclear. It is the moment the UFC crossed a truly unforgivable line. It is the moment fans are going to be absolutely furious about, and you're about to hear every shocking detail of it. What happened next, what Dana White said next, that is the precise moment this situation exploded into something darker, more manipulative, and more revealing than anything the UFC ever wants fans to hear. Because right as Adesanya turned to leave, Dana didn't say, "Let's talk." He didn't say, "We'll fix this." He didn't say, okay, let's negotiate." According to sources extremely close to the situation, the same type of insiders who later confirmed Francis Ngannou's brutal contract, battle details, Dana White tried to pressure Adesanya by subtly suggesting that leaving now would permanently damage his legacy. That was the first attempted leverage, but Adesanya didn't even blink. Legacy? The guy built his own legacy before the UFC, during the UFC, with or without belts. So Dana tried something else. He implied indirectly but unmistakably that if Adesanya left, the UFC would simply move on and brand someone else as the new face of the division. This is the same tired tactic fighters like Ngannou, John Jones, and Demetrius Johnson have all hinted at over the years. The UFC always has another poster boy ready, and that is when Adesanya stopped walking, because that is when the conversation truly crossed a line. And here's the quote the insiders have repeatedly shared. The quote Adesanya himself paraphrased in private conversations. The quote that perfectly captures exactly how the UFC views its fighters. Stars are replaceable, the machine isn't. Those 6 words will undoubtedly go down as some of the coldest ever spoken inside the fight business. Because once again, we are staring directly into the same pattern that fighters have complained about for years. A pattern thoroughly documented by reporters, analysts, and fighters themselves. The UFC has a long documented history of stating, subtly or directly, that no matter who you are, whether you're Ngannou, GSP, Jones, DJ, or Nate Diaz, they can always build someone new. And normally, that tactic works. Normally, fighters cave. Normally, fighters come crawling back. Normally, fighters don't possess the power to simply walk away. But this time, with this fighter, in this situation, Dana picked the wrong person to underestimate. Because unlike most fighters, Adesanya doesn't fear the unknown. He doesn't fear free agency. He doesn't fear testing the market. He doesn't fear losing a belt. He already did. He doesn't even fear the UFC's powerful PR machine. He only fears one thing: letting someone else define his value. And that was never going to happen. This is the same man who walked away from China after being scammed by promoters. The same man who walked away from Glory Kickboxing when the money didn't add up. The same man who turned down deals early in his MMA career because they didn't respect his word. He always bets on himself. He always stands on principle. And he never accepts being undervalued. Look back at his own words from his 2018 interview. Just after his UFC debut, "I didn't come into the UFC broke. I came in with money already. I wasn't desperate." That is one of the most important quotes in this entire saga. Because the UFC relies on desperation. They rely on fighters needing the money. They rely on fighters being willing to sacrifice their true value for the opportunity. But Adesanya, he never had that weakness. He came into the UFC winning. And now he's leaving the UFC winning. And here's what the UFC underestimated the most. Adesanya does not need them. He doesn't need their platform. He doesn't need their marketing. He doesn't need their belt. He is a brand. He is a global icon. He is a self-made superstar who can walk into boxing, kickboxing, PFL, one championship, or anywhere else, and instantly become the centerpiece of the entire organization. So Dana's attempt at leverage didn't intimidate him. It energized him. And when Adesanya turned back to face Dana, insiders say the entire room changed. The temperature, the air, the power dynamic, and what he said next. What he said is the real moment the UFC lost him forever. He said with an unnerving calm, "If you can replace me, then do it without me." Those words shattered the room. Those words removed all possibility of negotiation. Those words ended any chance of reconciliation. And then, according to one witness, Adesanya walked out so calmly it made everyone else nervous. But here's where things get even worse. And what many fans don't know, after Adesanya left the room, the UFC immediately began preparing for the fallout. They knew a star this big leaving would trigger absolute chaos. They knew fans would demand answers. They knew the media would smell blood. And the very first thing they did was try to control the narrative. Because if there is one thing the UFC is truly elite at, besides marketing, besides promotion, besides showmanship, it is expertly shaping the story their way. And they have a long, consistent history of doing just that. Example after example proves it. Remember when Ngannou left? Dana immediately went on a media blitz, subtly suggesting the Predator didn't want to fight tough opponents. But then Ngannou himself came out and said the real issue was pay. Remember when Demetrius Johnson left? Dana went public painting Mighty Mouse as difficult. Demetrius countered by revealing that the UFC pressured him repeatedly and flat out refused to promote him properly. Remember how Dana speaks about Nate Diaz, John Jones, Anderson Silva whenever contract disputes arise. The UFC always turns contract disputes into fighter problems, never company problems, never business problems, never structural problems. And if that power shift shook the UFC, what came next could truly redefine the entire sport. The new empire ahead. So what happened after Adesanya walked out? Exactly what you'd expect. The UFC immediately discussed strategies for framing his departure. Make it sound like he wants time off. Make it sound like he's just stepping away temporarily. Make it sound like he's not sure about fighting anymore. Make it sound like he's considering his future. They were preparing a full-blown PR shield before they even fully processed what had happened. And this is the moment the story takes an even more sinister turn. Because the UFC made one fatal mistake. They completely underestimated how prepared Adesanya was to walk away. Not quietly, but publicly. They underestimated the one thing that truly separates Adesanya from nearly every other fighter on the roster. He does not need them to tell his story. He has his own massive platform. He has millions of fans across YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, his own interviews, podcasts, brand deals, and global partnerships. He controls his own narrative, and that's why just hours later, when Adesanya finally broke his silence, he didn't mince words. He didn't hide. He didn't retreat into ambiguity. He came out swinging. His statement, the one he gave to his inner circle, was sharp, surgical, and absolutely scathing. I refuse to be undervalued by a company I helped build. And before people jump in and say, but Adesanya didn't build the UFC, let's talk about reality. Look at the real numbers. Look at the real impact. Look at the real influence. When Adesanya fights, fans tune in. He's one of the very few fighters who single-handedly moves pay-per-view numbers. He commands a global fan base spanning Nigeria, New Zealand, Australia, the US, China. Everywhere he's fought. His knockouts go viral. His walkouts go viral. His post-fight speeches go viral. His social media presence dwarfs half the roster combined. He's not just a fighter, he's a multi-platform brand. That's why his UFC debut earned him 6 figures, not rookie pay. That's why his PPV points regularly brought him more than 1 or 2 million in back-end revenue. That's why his fight with Pereira generated some of the biggest UFC numbers that entire year. And that is exactly why this next piece of information is even more shocking. When Adesanya left that meeting, the UFC did not chase him. Not immediately, not aggressively, not with urgency. Because in their minds, they believed the very same thing Dana said at the table: stars are replaceable, but they forgot one crucial thing. Adesanya isn't just a star, he's a phenomenon. And when a phenomenon walks away, he takes absolutely everything with him. The highlights, the hype, the drama, the build-up, the rivalries, the global fan base, the massive PPV numbers. And that is why, behind the scenes, panic finally set in, because someone in the room, a senior executive, according to the source, finally uttered the one sentence no one in the UFC ever wants to admit. If Izzy leaves, The middleweight division collapses. And you know what? They weren't wrong. Because without Adesanya, there are no more stadiums in Australia selling out in minutes. No more multi-million-dollar PPV rematches. No more epic rivalries with Whittaker, Pereira, Vettori, Costa. No more Stylebender era. No more global superstar at 185 pounds. The division loses its identity. The UFC loses a cornerstone. The fans lose a spectacle. And that's when the UFC finally realized the monumental mistake they had made. But it was far too late. Because Adesanya had already made up his mind. He was already and he was already preparing the next bombshell. The public one, where Adesanya would break his silence publicly, and the entire MMA world would turn upside down. The moment Adesanya closed that boardroom door behind him, the countdown truly began. Not for another fight, not for another title run, but for the UFC's absolute worst nightmare. The moment a global superstar decides to speak directly to the world, unfiltered, unedited, unafraid, and completely unwilling to protect the company that just tried to lowball him into silence. For hours, the MMA world spun into chaos. Journalists began circling, podcasts speculated wildly, fans flooded social media with rumors. Every conversation echoed the same burning question: why did Israel Adesanya walk away? But at that critical moment, the UFC stayed quiet, silent, careful, measured, because they knew something the public didn't. Adesanya wasn't cooling off. He wasn't re-evaluating. He wasn't reconsidering. He was preparing a message, preparing a statement, preparing to flip the entire narrative on its head. And then it happened. 5 minutes that utterly changed MMA. 5 minutes before the world saw it. 5 minutes before every journalist scrambled to rewrite their headlines. Because Adesanya pressed post. No PR filter. No corporate approval. No UFC formatting. Just his voice, raw, sharp, undeniable, and the statement was pure fire. The first sentence, the one that instantly went viral: the UFC lowered my pay, so I lowered my involvement. That was it. That was the blow. That was the moment the world understood this wasn't about time away, re-evaluating, or stepping back. This was a breakup. A public, messy, explosive breakup that the UFC never wanted and never expected to lose control of. He laid out the fact. He referenced the massive PPV points he earned, like the $2 million portion of the $3.118 million payout. He mentioned that he remained one of the highest paid fighters at UFC 3. He referenced the millions he generated for the company, the sold-out arenas, the viral clips, the international audiences. He listed all of it, not bragging, not whining, not pleading. He was documenting a fighter's true worth in an industry that constantly pretends fighters don't understand their own value. And then came the part that sent chills across the entire industry. He smiled, calmly, and said, "Watch what I do next." That was it. The foreshadowing, the promise, the warning. Because here's the undeniable truth. If Adesanya steps into boxing, he instantly becomes $1 million draw. If he goes to the PFL, they will treat him like royalty, just like they welcomed Ngannou as the highest paid heavyweight in the sport. If he goes to one championship, he becomes the face of their global expansion. If he creates his own PPV event, he keeps most of the revenue. The UFC knows this. Adesanya knows this. The fans know this. Because unlike almost any fighter in the entire history of the UFC, Adesanya doesn't need the promotion. The promotion needs him. And after everything they put on the table, the insulting offer, the dismissive tone, the replaceable star comment, the desperate PR spin, Adesanya's message was simple. He's not replaceable, he's not desperate, he's not trapped. He's Israel Adesanya, the stylebender, the superstar, the highlight machine, the global icon, left the UFC, not because of injuries, not because of age, not because of losses, not because he wanted time away, but because Dana White lowered his pay. That is the truth. That is the betrayal. That is the moment everything changed. And that is why the UFC will never fully recover from losing him.